Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar, Effective Leadership in Housing and Development. I'm Melissa Keene, a Senior Program Manager with the Institute for Local Government, and will be your webinar host and moderator this afternoon. More than half of renters in California and a third of homeowners are cost burdened or spend more than a third of their income on housing. This webinar will provide an overview of California's housing crisis, the development process, barriers to housing development, and the basics of the regional housing needs assessment allocations. And you'll hear from local officials on how to navigate your role in addressing the housing crisis. Here's a high-level overview of our agenda for this afternoon. We just have this quick welcome, and I'm going to cover some logistics about the webinar. And then we're going to hear from our colleagues at the California State Association of Counties and the League of California Cities. Both of their executive directors have joined us this afternoon to provide some opening and welcoming remarks. I'm going to provide a little bit of background for you all and set the stage in terms of what we're hearing at ILG from our local government colleagues across the state. And then we're going to hear short presentations from each of our panelists this afternoon. Mayan Johnson with the Southern California Association of Governments, John Hidahl, Supervisor with El Dorado County, and Cindy Silva, Councilmember with the City of Walnut Creek. After we hear from short presentations from each of them, we're going to go into a panel discussion and we're going to hear more from each of them on a number of questions. And then we definitely have some time held for Q&A at the end of the webinar, and then we'll share some additional opportunities for education and wrap up by 3:30. A couple of quick logistics before we jump in. You've probably noticed that your line has been muted and you will remain muted for the duration of the call due to the size of the audience. But that doesn't mean you can't ask us questions. So you should see a questions box in your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can type questions into us as the panelists at any point in time during the webinar. And then, as I just mentioned, we will have time held at the end to get through as many of those as possible. We may not get to all of the questions today, but we will also share contact information at the end, and you can follow up with us as needed. A quick information about ILG in case you aren't familiar with us. We are the affiliate of the League of California Cities, California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. We provide practical and easy-to-use resources so local agencies can effectively implement policies on the ground. We do this in a number of ways. We provide a lot of education and training, such as this webinar that you're on this afternoon. In addition to that, we also have a whole host of online resources on our website. We provide technical assistance in capacity building and convening services for local governments statewide. And we focus on four main program areas, what we call leadership and governance, which is some of the legal pieces that you guys need to be aware of as local officials, some of those local government basics, and then how to operate effectively as a governance team. We focus on civics education and workforce to help create that pipeline to public service and facilitate municipal school partnerships. We also focus on public engagement, so everything from getting started to dealing with difficult meeting participants to really helping embed public engagement into your local government operations. And lastly, we focus on sustainable communities, which this year we're focusing a lot on housing, hence the webinar that you are all joining us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Graham Knaus, the Executive Director of the California State Association of Counties, to provide some welcoming remarks. Graham?
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you all for the opportunity to join you today. CSAC, as Melissa indicated, is closely aligned with the Institute for Local Government. We have had a long-standing relationship and really value the partnership with ILG. It serves as a very unique forum designed to bring together cities, counties, and special districts to really get real-world expertise in navigating complex issues, and they're all around us, to increase capacity at the local level and really build trust in our communities. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it's all about community and providing services that make life better for our residents. I think that's why we're probably all here today. And you've all heard the phrase that all politics are local. And even in this virtual room, I can tell there's good evidence of that given the amount of attention on this particular issue. There's no city that isn't part of a county, even when the city is a county in and of itself, such as San Francisco, which is to highlight that we are all in this together and we all face both accountability and complexity together in terms of making progress. So I want to thank ILG's Executive Director and CEO, Erica Manuel, certainly my colleague, Carolyn Coleman, Executive Director of Cal Cities, to this opportunity to spend a few moments with you all today. When I flash back about 14 months ago, at the top of our priority list was housing and homelessness. The two issues go hand in hand, certainly, and even through the cloud of COVID-19, and as we begin to emerge from the pandemic, that remains the case. Now, as we sit here today, beginning to emerge on the other side of the pandemic, thanks to incredible work on the part of county-led public health departments and all other local government folks at the local level, we're encouraged by vaccinations and the progress that's been made there, but also refocusing our attention and efforts to address housing and homelessness. And so we're thankful for ILG in terms of pulling this together. During the pandemic, we saw some very innovative solutions at the local level, partnering with the state to address the immediate needs of unhoused Californians. Innovative solutions like Project Room Key, which provided temporary shelter and some quarantine options for folks, while Project Home Key, which emerged later in the pandemic, emerged to be a more permanent pathway towards housing. Critical to both of these programs are the wraparound supportive services provided by counties to really change the life trajectory for individuals, families, and communities moving towards self-sufficiency. And I reflect back on my time when I was back in Placer County, working through the early stages of homelessness solutions there. I could have never imagined the level of severity of the homelessness challenge we have in California today, nor the incredible amount of political will and the capital being dedicated to achieving solutions. We've never seen anything like this in our lifetime. And certainly one example of that is the political capital in the state's continued historic investments in housing, local planning, and homelessness. That begun under our prior governor, Jerry Brown, and has continued with Governor Newsom as we've seen these historic investments. And I think back to kind of the beginning of all this in 2017 with SB 2 providing ongoing housing funding for local governments and some initial planning grants for folks to make some progress. The Homeless Emergency Aid Program, known as HEAP, which followed in 2018, as did Proposition 1, the housing bond. There's a lot of progress that has been made around these issues. We've also seen some focus on infill infrastructure, additional local planning grants, and the projects Room Key and Home Key that I referenced earlier. These are all important investments, but nothing comes remotely close to the $12 billion proposal that's in the governor's May revision and puts a marker down with the intent to eradicate family homelessness in 5 years. What we've learned more than anything is that we need resources, but more than that, we need collaboration at the local level. We need all entities working together on both homelessness and housing. And so that's certainly cities and counties and the nonprofit community and the business community and the faith-based community, all of us working together to really create innovative solutions and bring our communities along. And, you know, you may be thinking about much of my comments centering around homelessness, and it's because there's a significant interaction between homelessness and housing and the lack of affordable housing in this state. These two things are so strongly linked together. We must address both the homelessness problem and have sufficient affordable housing in this state in order to truly make progress. As many of you know, in too many parts of our state, housing development, for one reason or another, has just not kept up with changes in our population. And so it's been an increasing squeeze. It's led to skyrocketing costs, families being crowded into tighter and tighter quarters, certainly the long commutes that clog up our infrastructure, and far too many that are at risk or have fallen into homelessness. And just like homelessness, California's housing crisis cannot be solved overnight. The housing development landscape is treacherous, it's heavily regulated, and the margins are small. However, and this moves us towards what we'll be talking about today, there are innovative and successful partnerships that have emerged across the state to truly begin to transform these issues. Local governments are being creative in their use of funding and planning grants to adopt by right housing ordinances, not an easy thing to pull off. Conduct programmatic environmental reviews to streamline approvals of conforming projects, which are so necessary, and really constructing the infrastructure improvements to support housing development and much, much more that you'll be hearing about. These solutions all require a cumulative political will at the city, county, community, and state level. It's not easy. We face substantial resistance in this, and that simply underscores the need for us to do it together. And with the leadership at the county board level and the city council level, what will it take a perspective? We know these projects can get off the drawing board and into production. We know that we can make progress on these issues. And that's why I'm so heartened to see so many plugged into this webinar today representing your communities. That's the point, right? We all need the tools in order to really make that progress. And what I really want to underscore is that it's you who are the leaders who can and will make real progress on California's housing crisis. It takes investment on the part of the state as well, but ultimately a change happens on the ground, and all of you are the leaders in your communities to be able to drive that change. It takes some time and patience and certainly funding to move housing projects through idea to completion and being available in the stock for what's available in communities. And as we all know, affordable housing has become increasingly expensive in this state. So as I close this opening, I've been really encouraged to see some of the creative strategies and the partnerships that have been formed to address housing issues, both by us in the local government space, but also developers and other stakeholders who are coming together to make projects feasible, to find ways to have projects pencil out that otherwise would not have. And so I'm hopeful that today you're able to learn more about these projects, engage in robust discussion, and have us learn from you as well as we all explore solutions to move some of the roadblocks out of the way and ultimately make progress in our communities. At the end of the day, we all share the same goal of ensuring that housing is built in our communities, that the California dream remains alive for all residents, and that we step forward in ways where we are, we're walking through the path of complexity and challenge in a way that creates transparency and accountability for all of us as we move forward in this. And so really excited to join you all today.
Thank you so much, Graham. Really appreciate you joining us and sharing your thoughts on this topic this afternoon. I think you hit one of the big key themes on the head in your remarks just now, in that we're all in this together. This is not a jurisdictional problem. This is not one city's problem or one county's problem. This really is so interconnected and so complex that these solutions that we're looking at really need to be thought about in that same way. Our cities are so close-knit together, particularly in certain parts of the state. And as you mentioned, there is no city that isn't part of a county. So really appreciate your thoughts about the collaboration that's needed and the big picture thinking in terms of the statewide and region-wide approach that we need to be thinking through to address some of these challenges. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carolyn Coleman, the Executive Director of the League of California Cities, to provide us some thoughts from the city perspective. Carolyn?
Melissa, thank you so much for inviting me to join today's session. Graham, thank you for those remarks. I agree with all of them, and could say that you took all of the words out of my mouth, but you've saved a few for me, and I appreciate that, and I truly appreciate the strong partnership that Cal Cities enjoys with CSAC. The key theme, I believe, is partnership, and we all know that we are stronger together than we are apart. And if I think about an issue that is uniting us and unifying us more than getting over the pandemic, it is in the area of housing and homelessness. I support and echo everything that Graham said about homelessness. I do acknowledge that in terms of solutions, cities tend to focus on the brick and mortar side of the homelessness solution, but we can't have a solution to homelessness without also bringing to bear all the important resources that come through our counties. So another example of a strong partnership on the ground that is important to our success. To all of you who are on the call today, I feel a little bit like we're probably preaching to the choir, but I'm so glad you're here and willing to share your good ideas on how we solve this problem together. From the city perspective, like so many workers in our communities, I know that you all and those I work with every day have been truly in overdrive trying to protect our communities from the effects of the pandemic and the economic recession that we were experiencing. Here we are over a year later, and certainly there's quite a bit of light at the end of the tunnel with new resources coming into all of our communities, both cities and counties and the state, from the federal government to help us recover from and really accelerate the recovery in our communities. And that also means the potential for new investments, much needed investments in housing in our community. For cities, while we were very focused on the pandemic as an emergency, cities are also focused on the other emergency in our state, which is around helping all of our residents ensure that they have a safe and quality place to live. City officials, acknowledge that while the year 2020 sort of put some progress on pause, as we've turned the corner in 2021, this is right back at the top of our priority list, and cities are recommitting and resolving, doing their part to resolve this challenge. At the current moment, I know that so many of our cities and regional governments who are joining us on the call today and across the country, you all have been undergoing a very intense process updating your local housing element, and I know that's part of what will be discussed today. That includes, of course, identifying land for housing and planning and zoning to provide these additional housing units. Now, planning for and adopting a housing element is, I know, a very time-consuming and a costly process, but it does support the very important foundation of getting more housing built in our state, which I think is an agreed-upon goal across all parts of our state. At the end of this process that cities are undergoing, they will have identified and planned for more than 2 million units of new housing statewide over the next 8 years. And that's on top of already the millions of units that have already been planned for and zoned and approved that are in the pipeline, if you will. So we really need some ways and in the coming months and the coming years to take the planning from concept to reality, and for those projects to have been that have been approved, to find ways for those to move forward. We talk a lot about partnership, and as we talk about solutions to housing and to homelessness, Graham has talked about the county perspective. I'm talking from the city perspective. A very important partner in this solution is also the state. And as the state legislative cycle continues to move forward, housing continues to be at the forefront of the legislature's attention. As we speak, there are dozens of bills that seek to alter the relationship between the state and local governments on land use issues. Now, I'll be frank with you. Some of those bills will provide very helpful assistance. Graham talked about some of the resources that are being proposed to help address the housing crisis. Some will streamline the approval process, which also could be helpful to cities as we plan for more homes. But in all candor, some might undermine the constitutional authority granted to our cities. And that, of course, is something that we would find very problematic. We also think that some things that are being proposed might undermine the very important role that our residents play in the planning process for housing. But we're going to continue to stay at the table and to work with the legislature to forge solutions that work for our cities. You know, I've been with Cal Cities for a little over 4 years now, and just the short time I've been at Cal Cities, the legislature has passed over 50 bills to help address the housing crisis. I think we really do need an opportunity to put those ideas into motion before we change the landscape with yet another new set of rules. With the work and the innovation and the planning that is already taking place at the local level and the investments of time and resources that are involved in that, we really do need an opportunity to let these great ideas play out to address the housing crisis. So we remain committed to working with the legislature to forge good ideas on how we do that together. One of the reasons why I'm so excited, and I said to Melissa and her colleagues about this webinar today, is I think it underscores that our cities, our local governments, and our counties recognize the very, very important role they have in ensuring that all Californians have a place to live in our state. This is an issue that has been decades in the making. We will not solve it overnight. By having a strong partnership and all levels of government focused on solutions, I'm convinced, and I will continue to be convinced, that we can get it done. Webinars like today give us an opportunity to learn about some of the innovations taking places in different cities. And my team has heard me say here, one of the great things about Cal Cities and about CSAC is that we can get our members together and we can steal great ideas from each other and replicate them in other communities. So this is another opportunity for us to do that today. And I so appreciate all of you being here and your commitment to helping us solve this crisis. And again, thank you to ILG for bringing this session together. Thanks so much, Melissa.
Thank you, Carolyn. Really appreciate you joining us this afternoon and sharing your thoughts on this topic as well. You made a really great point about the ever-changing landscape that is the housing and planning world for our local government colleagues. You shared the sheer number of bills that get before the legislature every year on these topics really make it hard to navigate as everything changes, you know, year by year. I would definitely encourage everybody on the phone to access the resources that the League and CSAC both have on these topics and the information they have about these bills. They both have phenomenal lobbyists that are working on your behalf at the state legislature, and so definitely would just encourage you to use their to tap into those resources that you have and make sure you're up to date with what's going on and everything that's happening there. So Carolyn and Graham, I know you may have other priorities this afternoon, so I just want to take this opportunity before we move on to thank you again for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with everybody on the line today.
Thank you so much.
Before we jump into our presentations, which we will hear from Maayan Johnson, as you just heard, this is kind of a regional need as well, and so she's going to speak from the regional perspective from the Southern California Association of Governments, and then we will hear more from the city and county perspective here from Supervisor John Hidahl and Councilmember Cindy Silva. But just want to quickly share some information about ILG's connection to this topic and to this work. We are part of the statewide Housing Technical Assistance Program that is a combination of a number of different firms and nonprofits that are really working to help you all navigate this issue and these challenges. We are involved in 3 different ways here. The first of which you see on the right-hand side of the screen there, local leader training. And so that's what this webinar is part of a broader series that we're doing to really help inform our local leaders about some of these topics and how to lead through all of these things. This is the third one in the series, and at the end of this webinar, we'll share information about the upcoming trainings that are happening once a month throughout the rest of this year almost. Second, in the middle there, you see that we're also developing and updating resources for planning commissioners. ILG has a flagship resource called the Planning Commissioners Handbook that hasn't been updated in a number of years. So we're working through that process right now to update the handbook and really make that a go-to resource for all of the cities and counties on the line, hopefully. And then in conjunction with that, we're also will be producing some regional trainings for planning commissioners that will go hand in hand with that update to the handbook and really work through some of the key pieces that cities and counties need to know as they become new planning commissioners and things like that. So their roles, all of the planning documents and how they all interwork together, some of the legal pieces and the ethics pieces that go along with that, the public engagement and community engagement component that is key to so many of these decisions. As Carolyn mentioned, things like the housing element updates or general plan updates all require that public engagement component as well. And then a third, as you see on this list, is also statewide and regional technical assistance. So the team has also been meeting with regional city and county entities across the state to really hear from you all what challenges you're facing, what needs do you have for resources or technical assistance. And right now the team is working through combing through all of that information, and really will be producing regional technical assistance plans that meet your local needs. To Graham's point, there is no one-size-fits-all approach or solution to this either, and so we want to be making sure that these technical assistance plans are taking into consideration your regional needs as well. So just a few things that we're hearing from the field. I'm sure none of this will surprise anybody on the line as you are working through these challenges on a daily basis. We just wanted to share some of the things that we're hearing in the field from those meetings and other conversations that we're having with cities and counties statewide. There's a number of barriers. Some of these have already been covered in Carolyn and Graham's remarks, but you see that there's a myriad of challenges and barriers to really having more housing development in your cities and counties, developer interest, aging infrastructure or building new infrastructure, or just infrastructure costs. There is some funding available, as Graham mentioned as well, coming through to help with some of this, but it still remains a challenge. Funding just in general, whether that's financing or funding for, again, infrastructure or other wraparound pieces of housing development. A limited staff capacity. We know that you're all working with very small staffs, and some of which has been impacted severely by the pandemic through layoffs or other limitations as well. The public engagement requirements that I chatted about just a little bit ago. So there's more requirements coming in from the state. The challenge to do that in a virtual environment, we've recognized that and are trying to help you all navigate that as well. Some cities and counties have very limited site availability for new housing development. If they're really already developed out, it's hard to find, even identify those new sites for potential housing. And prevailing wage is something that we're hearing as well. In terms of resource needs, some of the things that have been identified is really help thinking through ADU ordinances and toolkits, whether that's plans or processes or ordinances, sample ordinances that cities and counties can tailor to meet their needs. Model objective design standards, sample RFPs for consultants, particularly as it relates to housing element updates or other types of needs there. And then technical assistance needs. Again, we're coming back to this collaboration idea. Not everywhere has the infrastructure to have that regional collaboration, and so helping either create that infrastructure or facilitate those regional conversations. Something else that has come up is potentially having an on-demand helpline or help desk that can answer questions in a more quick fashion. Public engagement again, and really the TA to help you all navigate that, building relationships with developers, help with specific plans or CEQA, and then again, innovative financing. You see that those kind of mirror some of the barriers that were identified as well. So hopefully there's more help coming. I do want to share one resource with you before we jump into the presentations. This is recently came online from the Department of Housing and Community Development. It's the Housing Planning Hub site. So as these resources and technical assistance come online, they will be posted on this site. I know that's really a funky URL there, but we will be posting the slide decks and link to that so you can have access to it. And you'll see that some of this has already started to populate with different resources that are coming online, and there will definitely be more in the near future. Okay. So essentially just stay tuned. ILG will be sharing more resources. HCD will be sharing more resources, hopefully to help you guys navigate this a little bit better. But I want to make sure we have time to get through all of our presentations and the discussion. So first up, I'm going to turn it over to Mayan Johnson with SCAG to talk through the regional aspect of this. Mayan?
Great. Thank you, Melissa. I'm Mayan Johnson. I'm Housing Program Manager at Southern California Association of Governments. Excuse me. And I've been at SCAG for over 15 years. And I've actually worked on 3 RHNA cycles, and I'm also a former, or also known as a recovering, planning commissioner for the city of Fullerton in Orange County. So I have been working a lot on the regional housing crisis, but I do also have some experience at the local level. Right, next slide, please. So for those unfamiliar with the SCAG region, we are both a Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, and a COG, or Council of Governments. The Council of Governments is the state designation, and I'll get a little bit into the RHNA process, but as the COG for 191 cities and 6 counties, we are the COG responsible for developing the RHNA allocation for all of our jurisdictions. To get a sense of how big we are, we have about 19 million people covering these 6 counties. And by 2045, we're expected to have over 22.5 million people. So we cover urban, suburban, rural, infill, greenfield development, coastal, inland, you name it, we got it. So we are very, very large. And next slide, please. So the regional role in housing, up until maybe the past few years, one of our main programs, and really only programs for housing and the regional role at SCAG, is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, RHNA, another 4-letter word to add to your vocabulary. But it's a state housing law requirement to determine existing and projected housing needs. So it's not just what you need in the future for housing based on growth, but it's also for housing need that you need right now based on your current population and households. It's an 8-year planning period, and the planning periods actually differ depending on your COG. So the SCAG region is on a different schedule than, let's say, if you're in the ABAG region or SANDAG or SACOG, as my fellow panelists are part of. But for the SCAG region, our 5th RHNA cycle, so if you pull up a housing element right now for a SCAG jurisdiction, it covers the planning period October 2013 through 2021. But right now they're developing their 6th cycle housing element. We just finished that RHNA earlier this year. That will cover October 2021 through 2029. And that is actually due for the SCAG region in October 2021. But of course, depending on your local council of governments, your housing element due date will be different because you'll be on a different cycle. Next slide, please. So the RHNA allocation itself, because everyone knows it as a number and usually it's too high, and a lot of jurisdictions don't want to deal with such a high RHNA. So for the SCAG region, our regional housing need for the 6th cycle was about 1.34 million units. And I will say, yes, that is high. It feels high because if you compare it to prior cycles, it is the highest that out of the 3 I've worked on, this is the highest. In comparison, the 5th cycle was about 412,000. So there was a lot of sticker shock this time around when we distributed the RHNA allocation. But again, keep in mind that the RHNA is a representation of existing and projected housing needs. So the past emphasized projected housing need. This time there's an increased emphasis on existing housing need. And I'll go into a few slides about what that visually looks like. And as Carolyn Coleman had mentioned earlier, the existing need has been decades in the making. So just looking at the RHNA process itself, or how you get to a local housing element. So a quick overview, the California Department of Housing and Community Development, also known as HCD, they give each council of governments a regional number. So for SCAG, that's 1.34 million. They look at data sets provided by the COG, California Department of Finance, but they come up with the number. So it's different for every COG in the state. And then at that point, it's up to the COG to develop and adopt and apply a RHNA methodology. So this methodology is what distributes that regional determination to each jurisdiction. So for SCAG, the 6-cycle methodology considers access to transit, access to jobs, projected household growth, disadvantaged communities, and a few other factors. But again, the methodology is determined by the COG itself, and it can vary by cycle. So what SANDAG has adopted as their methodology is different from SCAG, will be different from ABAG, different from SACOG. So the methodology is adopted by the COG, applied to the determination, and then you get the final RHNA allocation for each jurisdiction. So that is a jurisdiction's RHNA number. Then it's up to the jurisdiction to determine how they're going to accommodate their RHNA allocation. So they prepare a housing element as a chapter of their general plan, and then they submit this plan to HCD, who reviews it and ensures that it's compliant with state housing law. After HCD provides review and comment, it's up to the jurisdiction to adopt their local housing element and make any site and rezonings necessary to ensure that it's in compliance with state housing law. So that's how you get from a regional need all the way down to what you're doing at the local level for your jurisdiction. So again, RHNA is a quantification of housing need for the planning period, representing existing need and projected need. Next slide. So the phrase decades in the making, this is a visualization of that. So if you look around, this is for the SCAG region for building permits, but we're seeing this, this trend throughout the state. If you look around in your local jurisdiction in your city and you look around and say, hey, there's a lot of building activity going on. It's been this way for 10 years. You're not wrong. In comparison to about 10 years ago, when we're still trying to get out of that recession, there has been quite a number of building activity locally. But if you go back decades, looking at the 70s and 80s, this was actually the heyday of building permits, building activity. And you can see too, in the 90s, a lot of the development was focused on single family units rather than multifamily. So a lot of multifamily apartment building feels new compared to the 90s. But if you look at the 70s and 80s, it's pretty comparable about what types of products and housing types are coming on board to accommodate for housing need. Next slide. So you may ask also, well, housing supply hasn't kept up with need, but what about population growth? How does that compare? Because if they're in tandem, then maybe it isn't a problem. But once you look at the ratio between housing supply added and population, it's not keeping up either. So you saw that the large amount of growth in the 70s and 80s, 1 new unit for every 1 3/4 person added to the population, that's the 70s. By the 80s, that ratio dropped to about 1 new unit for every 3.15 persons added. And by the 90s, all those single family units, you have 1 new unit added for 4.5 persons added to the population. And that ratio's improved over the past decade or so. So we're about 1 new unit for every 2.64 persons added. What this means is that that existing need, we are still trying to keep up with. That decades in the making, this is a visualization of that. So it's not just planning for the next 8 years and how much you're going to grow. It's also planning for what you need right now and what you've needed and haven't been able to keep up with. Next slide, please. So just looking at the 5th RHNA cycle for the SCAG region and also throughout the state, kind of breaking it down. So sort of good news, for the 5th RHNA cycle for the SCAG region, we had about 412,000 units. As a whole, we've met about 67% of that need. But then if you look at what's actually been permitted by income category, the most of that, about 80%, have been market rate. And less than 10% have been affordable housing. So again, when you think of that visualization of the units needed. So there's multifamily, there's single family. We've met a lot of our market rate needs, but we've been lagging behind for affordable housing. And this trend's actually seen throughout the state, not just in the SCAG region, but in other COGs for the 5th cycle. And then just looking at California's residential building permits, of course, this is hard to get accurate because we're all on different RHNA cycles, but you can see a similar trend where over 3/4 of what's been permitted in the state has been market rate. And so affordable housing hasn't been at the forefront or as part of the regular conversation we've been having. So I look forward to being part of this discussion that we'll have after my panelists present as well, but how we can address these barriers in this regional and local problem. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mayan. And there you can see the website and email address if you have additional questions. Do want to just plug for all of the attendees on the line. If you do have questions, please feel free to drop them into that questions box that you see in your control panel. And as I mentioned earlier, we will have time towards the end of the webinar to take as many of those as possible. With that, I am going to turn it over to Supervisor John Hidahl with El Dorado County.
Good afternoon,
John?
all. Yeah. Gotta get it off mute. There we go. Good afternoon. I'm John Hidahl. I'm the District 1 Supervisor for El Dorado County and current chair of our board. I represent El Dorado Hills, or the majority of El Dorado Hills, in my role. I'm a 5th-generation Californian. My great-great-grandfather immigrated to California during the gold rush. I've lived in El Dorado Hills for 42 years, so quite a bit of longevity within El Dorado County. Most of you probably know El Dorado County became famous for being the site of the 1848 gold discovery that sparked the California Gold Rush. The county was one of California's original 27 counties, created effective February 18th, 1850. And the name El Dorado is derived from the Spanish meaning the gilded or golden. So we consider ourselves the Golden Hills and the source of gold in California, or at least the discovery of gold in California. Today, El Dorado County is internationally known as being one of the gateways to Lake Tahoe and the city of South Lake Tahoe at state line. El Dorado Hills and its businesses have been most closely affiliated with El Dorado County for some time, and El Dorado County is recognized as being a rural county. So we belong to organizations like CSAC, but we also belong to RCRC, the Rural Counties Organization. El Dorado County is part of the Sacramento metropolitan area, and therefore we're a member of SACOG. So as Mayan mentioned, there's various COGs across the state, and we happen to belong to the SACOG affiliation, so we get our RHNA numbers via that mechanism. It's both socially and economically integrated across with our western neighbor, which is Sacramento County and the city of Folsom. And we have one affordable housing project, which is on White Rock Village, built in 2005, and one mobile home park. So I'm making that statement because we have not been able to attain the desired level of affordable housing within El Dorado County, and those are the two most recently done in El Dorado Hills. So with that, I would like to kind of introduce you to the slide set and give you a little bit more viewpoint of what El Dorado Hills is all about. As I mentioned, we're the western gateway to El Dorado County. South Shore Lake Tahoe is the eastern gateway coming from Nevada. So we can have the next slide. To give you some of our demographics, we're 40 minutes from downtown Sacramento. So for many, many years, we've been recognized as a bedroom community serving the Sacramento area. And that creates a lot of commute traffic down Highway 50 and a lot of congestion. So that's obviously not a workable solution. We really need to create housing closer to where people work, and that's why workforce housing is a big push that El Dorado County has looked at. We're 90 minutes from Lake Tahoe. We have great schools, nationally recognized sports programs, community activities. From a demographics perspective, 48.5 square miles, population roughly of 46,000. We'll get a confirmation on that come September when we get our census numbers. The median age for El Dorado County residents is 44, and the median household income is $137,000 per year, and the median property value is $630. Oh, I need to correct that. It just changed a minute ago. So the dynamics of housing costs is incredible. If you don't keep up with it minute by minute, it jumps. So just leave that as a footnote. Next slide, please. So to kind of give you some familiarity with some of our amenities, the lifestyle experience in terms of dining, retail, and living in El Dorado Hills is beyond compare, in my opinion. We have a town center that's located in our downtown district, unique destination for many different opportunities, and we serve the greater Sacramento region. So there's a couple of pictures of gatherings and activities in our town center. Next slide. Restaurants, entertainment, shopping, retail. The major new attraction that's coming is actually some housing, town center apartments. And I know Cindy visited El Dorado Hills recently, and she became familiar with the town center apartments construction. So we're looking forward to that opening. There's supposed to be a phased opening that should be starting here within another month or so. So we will start seeing occupants within our town center area in a 5-story apartment complex with all internal parking, well designed. The Spanos Corporation is the sponsor of that, the developer of it, but we're all looking forward to having new residents occupy the town center area. Next slide. Folsom Lake is another one of our big attractions. I didn't want to forget that. So access to Folsom Lake from El Dorado Hills provides many recreational opportunities for residents, beautiful viewscapes, and that's been one of the large attractions for El Dorado Hills and some of our developments. Next slide. So El Dorado Hills Business Park is also a major attraction. It was a park that was started many, many years ago. We're still growing. It was developed as a research and development business park. And we're now seeing proposed changes in general land use and also in zoning to add a residential component to that, some of which includes mixed use where you'd have both commercial and residential, but those are things that are still in work. And then the next slide. This is more information on the business park. It's 800 acres, houses some of the county's largest employers, as you might imagine. We are encouraging cutting edge technology, and the future of the business park is something that's being continually monitored and promoted in terms of trying to attract the proper kinds of businesses, high paying jobs, and a good wage base with those jobs. So that's an ongoing effort. Next slide. And in talking about the views and Lake Tahoe and some of the other things, this is one of the major housing developments that's been developed since 1999 in El Dorado Hills called Serrano. There's a wide selection of custom homes and pre-designed homes available. 1,000 acres of open space have been included in that development. Ponds, creeks, walking trails, neighborhood parks, major golf course. So those two images there, the one on the left in particular kind of gives you the view from up on Serrano looking towards Folsom Lake and the surrounding area. It's just a beautiful place to live. So I'll kind of conclude with that. Don't think there's another slide after this one. Melissa, I think we're done.
No, this is, yes, the end of yours, your
Okay.
slide. So thank you very much, John. Sorry, go ahead.
I just said thank you for the opportunity. I enjoy the presentation.
Okay, next up, we are going to hear from Councilmember Cindy Silva from Walnut Creek. So let me get her slides up here. Okay, Cindy.
Thank you, Melissa, very much. And thank you, John and my, I appreciated your regional and county perspectives on this. And I, as Melissa mentioned earlier, I am a 15-year council member from the city of Walnut Creek. Prior to being on the city council, I too was on the planning commission in Walnut Creek for about 3 years. And it was during the last time we adopted our general plan. So it was a lot of work. And just for point of reference, Walnut Creek is in the Association of Bay Area Governments, COG. ABAG is what it's called. 9 counties. We're one of the 102 cities in ABAG. And we are just now, as of 2 weeks ago, received our finalized draft RHNA numbers. With the appeals process now starts, but we will not have our housing element due until about a year from now. And then it will take effect 2023 to 2031. And this will be my 3rd RHNA housing element cycle with the city. Next slide, please. So really, since you have three different perspectives here, let me just give you a brief setting the stage about housing in Walnut Creek. Every 2 years, the Walnut Creek City Council establishes 3, 4, 5 strategic priorities. And in recent years, one of our goals has been to improve the availability and affordability of housing. Now, when we set that goal, we also talked about what a heavy lift that would be, because we recognize there is no one program that will solve all the problems. We're going to need a robust toolkit of optional ways to do it and use the whole elements in the toolkit. We knew that there would be community concerns and that those need to be identified and addressed through these processes. And we also knew that there were a number of misperceptions out there about what housing and affordable housing really is and what the gap is and why we do have this crisis. And of course, we also understand that housing issues are truly contextual. All of our communities are essentially different. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is start the same way John did by giving you a little bit of background about Walnut Creek. We're a mid-sized Bay Area city. We are in the East Bay, Contra Costa County, and we are at the base of Mount Diablo. Although we are perceived as an affluent community, our median household income is actually quite low at $86,000. Out of our 70,000 residents, 63% are college graduates, yet only 33% of our households and our residents are actually in the workforce. And that is because we have an aging population. 30% of our community is 65 or older. Another 10% are older than 55 to 65, and very few are actually under the age of 18. So what that actually translates to from a housing perspective, and I'm hearkening back to Mayan's slide that I just saw today, is that we average only 2.1 persons per household in Walnut Creek. So we actually have to produce more housing units per capita than a community in another part of the state. The average, by the way, in California right now is 2.94, but in Imperial County, the average is just under 4. So we have very different housing requirements. Next slide, please. Some other facts about Walnut Creek. We are at the center of the East Bay of commerce, healthcare, the performing and visual arts, and also of the outdoor environment. We have an 800,000 square foot outdoor mall that has actually kept our traditional and historic downtown alive. We actually import about 50,000 employees every day for work, and 15% of those employees are working in the healthcare arena because we have 3 major hospitals in Walnut Creek. The performing and visual arts represents a $45 million component of our annual economic activity, and the center of that is an art center that hosts 300 performances each year, and about 250,000 guests, 30% of whom come from outside the county. But we don't want you to think we have paved all of our paradise. Actually, 20% of Walnut Creek's geographic area is preserved in public open space lands of about 3,000 acres, and we're connected to the Mount Diablo State Park and the East Bay Parks. Next slide, please. Walnut Creek is also at the center of transportation in the East Bay. We are located directly at the intersection of 2 major highways, through which 225,000 cars pass per day. We are on the east-west major corridor of the Bay Area Rapid Transit District, and we have the most traversed road in Contra Costa County, carrying 75,000 car trips per day. Next slide, please. Finally, from a housing perspective, we are an urban suburb. We actually grew up as a community between 1950 and 1970 when, yes, that is not a typo, that was the growth we experienced in Walnut Creek. We quadrupled in size twice over 2 decades. The other thing is we are not your typical bedroom community. We are very different from El Dorado Hills. Of our 34,000 housing units, 2/3 are attached. They are apartments, they're condominiums, and they're townhomes. And this is not new. This started in the 1960s and 1970s and followed that path of permitting that Mayan was showing in her slide earlier. We have had significantly more multifamily housing in the last 10 years, but it it didn't start in the last 10 years. Next slide, please. And this really reflects our longstanding commitment to housing and to multifamily housing in particular. And our vision really as a community is to support housing of all types for all incomes and all ages, while at the same time finding that balance to protecting our open space areas, preserving the character of all of our different neighborhoods, ensuring that we have adequate jobs to support the job housing balance, and also to reduce the impacts on the environment that we produce. And so I am looking forward to talking more about how housing rolls out in Walnut Creek and the barriers and the tools that we've been using. And thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Cindy. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share. We're going to go into a panel discussion, but as we are talking, again, make sure to feel free to drop in questions into the questions box as you have them, and we will get to a few of those towards the end of the webinar. But to kick us off, as you've just heard, the communities that you all serve are very different, geographically, politically, economically. Can you share from your perspective what the major barriers to housing development in your communities are? And Cindy, do you want to go ahead and kick us off since you were just chatting?
Happy to. And I appreciate the question because it will be interesting to see how Southern California and rural counties approach this. I think the biggest barrier is cost, direct costs, land costs, materials costs, labor costs. Materials costs just in recent months have almost quadrupled. A board foot of lumber is now 4 times what it cost 6 months ago. There's also the indirect costs that are impacting housing, and these are the indirect costs of other policies that we are trying to put forward, whether that's affordable housing and therefore affordable housing fees, traffic impacts, park services, and climate change and climate resiliency. And then I would say another barrier is the dollars that we need at the local level to be able to plan for and implement good housing policies in order to support the expansion of housing. And I'll leave it there for the moment because there are some other ideas and we might want to chat.
I can jump in on that too. I mean, I'm a little biased because I work for a regional organization, but I see one of the biggest barriers, at least working 15 years on RHNA, is that the housing crisis and its solutions, that they're confined to jurisdictional boundaries. Because from the bird's eye view at the SCAG region, we cover 191 cities, 6 counties, and each have their own individual constraints of how they're going to be able to supply housing or permit housing. And so the perspective where it's only confined to the jurisdictional boundary, that the housing crisis can only be solved through the jurisdictional boundary, I think that prevents us then from looking at bigger solutions that go beyond what a city can do. And it can actually hinder some of the partnerships we'd like to form in challenging the housing crisis. So I think just that mindset where the problem and the solution are going to be within a city boundary is one of the major barriers to the housing crisis.
I'd just like to add to Cindy's comment, the affordability of being able to build the housing is probably the biggest barrier we have. So I've come to the conclusion, unless we have significant government subsidies or sponsorship of housing, Graham spoke a little bit about what's going on with homelessness, the fact that the governor has put forth money to purchase motels, hotels, that sort of thing, convert them into affordable housing for the homeless. All of that helps meet the needs of the homeless, but also housing in particular. So it's without that government sponsorship and funding, it's going to be extremely difficult. And then the other part of it is the longer term type of funding that's available through land trusts and other things. We're looking at that part of it. But beyond just the cost, one of the biggest issues that we face is that the residents who've moved here into El Dorado County and Emerald Hills in particular most recently don't want to see any more growth. They don't want to see more housing. They don't want to see places for the homeless. unless it's somewhere else. There's this NIMBYism thing that happens to a lot of people. They moved here for a purpose, right? For a quality of life that they were able to attain by moving to the location, but they don't want to see that diminished by more people, more traffic, more housing, all of those things. So it's always a situation that where do you put that affordable housing? Where do you build the new housing? Even if it's market rate housing, we have objections to that because of transportation and noise and anything. So everything else that goes with that, rather. So a lot of the challenge we have, the barrier, is letting people understand that if we don't start deciding on our own where we're going to accommodate the RHNA housing numbers, that the state will do that for us. And nobody wants to give up our local control, our local ability to evaluate projects and determine what's appropriate for it. And there's already action going at the state to reverse that, so that local entities would no longer have that ability of using discretion in how projects get approved. As when they become ministerial type projects, the more the community loses its sense of control and balance within the community. So that's ultimately one of the threats that goes along with we have to build housing somehow, or it will be done for us.
Melissa, we can't hear you.
Thank you. Always try to mute myself for the background noise and inevitably forget to unmute myself. But it sounds like a lot of what you're sharing is similar to where we started in Graham and Carolyn's comments, and also what we have been hearing statewide. The cost is a huge barrier. Some of the community engagement pieces and the conversations with your community can be a challenge. To Mayon's point, the thinking about just individual entities, jurisdictions, as opposed to thinking from a broader scale, which is something obviously Graham and Carolyn also hit on. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the barriers, what tools are your jurisdictions using to combat some of this? John, I know you talked a little bit about the trust funds and things like that, but are there other tools that have been working in your jurisdictions that your colleagues might benefit from?
I'll go ahead and start. One of the things that I found very helpful is we have an active group of residents that have formed a group about 2 years ago. They're a nonprofit, but it's called Housing El Dorado. And they are entering into the discussion, not only for homelessness housing, which is where they started, but affordable housing, and trying to determine where are suitable locations and doing some of that front work. Because from my perspective, the biggest advantage is when the community starts pulling the need for affordable housing or new housing into the community, it's a whole lot better than government trying to push it in. That's always going to be faced with resistance. But when people who are maybe middle of the road start hearing there's an active group that's trying to promote affordable housing and work with various affordable housing builders, developers, to try to encourage them to come in and make use of state properties that are surplus or whatever it is to build that first entry of a new affordable housing venture into a community, that kind of opens up the door for other people to start thinking that wasn't so bad. We need to consider more of that, because it's a pull as opposed to a push. So that's one of the huge tools that I'm trying to utilize, is in relating to the public, that there are organizations that really are supporting more affordable housing and trying to do it the right way with discretionary authority, as opposed to, okay, this is where it's going to go. It's an SB 35 project. And I don't want to get into SB 35 discussions, but that causes a lot of concern with a lot of residents.
From the regional angle, so RHNA, we always said, or a lot of jurisdictions have said, it's an unfunded state mandate. Here's a RHNA number, see you in 8 years, was kind of the mode of operation. But nowadays, especially in the past few years, the state has actually put a lot more funding towards housing, whether that's planning for your housing element or implementing it. So AB 101, which was passed, I believe, in 2019, set aside $250 million statewide for planning and programs to accelerate housing production, basically helping jurisdictions to achieve their 6-cycle housing element. So there's two main programs that came out of it. One is called LEAP, Local Early Action Planning Grant Program, and the other one is called REAP, Regional Early Action Planning Program. So LEAP funding is about 125 million statewide. That's funding directly to local jurisdictions to prepare housing elements, implement housing elements, non-competitive, and it's just based on population size. The REAP program is funding for directly to COGS, and then COGS can develop regional programs, local programs, depending on what they'd like to do. And at SCAG, what we're doing with the $47 million we've been awarded through REAP, we're dedicating of that half, so 23 million, to partner with what we call our subregions, our subregional COG partners. I showed you the map, 191 cities, 6 counties. What's needed in Ventura County for the housing solutions is going to be different from, let's say, the city of Los Angeles or Eastern Coachella Valley, because we're just so big. But the intention of this subregional partnership program is to take advantage of economies of scale. So things such as regional housing trust fund, as John had mentioned, or community land trusts. It can be difficult if you're a small to medium-sized city to implement them because it can get expensive, resource heavy. But if you partner with surrounding cities, in SCAG we have 15 subregions, and so through that we're hoping that they can augment what local jurisdictions are already doing for their LEAP funding, and most of them have already applied and received the funding, but also to take advantage of the economy of scale to do the bigger projects that they wouldn't be able to do on their own. So regional housing trust fund, community land trusts, ordinance templates that they can use that's tailored for their subregion. So we're seeing a whole host of projects that are going to be coming through. Of course, the only problem is all this funding has to be spent by June 30th, 2023. So it's urgent and exciting. But then at the state level, with the May budget revise from the governor, there is, I don't have the full details yet, they're still forming them, but so far it's been announced about $500 million statewide. We don't know if it's going to be competitive grants, how this will be allocated, but in a sense, it's also to help implement and integrate regional and local plans together, and just addressing the housing crisis through other ways too, not just limited to planning and programs. So I'm sorry I don't have any details for you today on that, but it is something we're watching, and we're hoping that at least at the regional level, we can work with our sub-regional and local partners through all of these challenges and looking for solutions. Cindy, you're on mute.
It looks like you're muted now. Yeah.
Back at you, right? So Walnut Creek's perspective, I'm very fortunate. When I was elected to the city council, my predecessors had already taken up the mantle of how do we address the housing affordability and availability issue. And so there was already a focus on multifamily housing and near downtown and in our core area where people could walk or bicycle, needed to use cars less. But here are some of the programs in the toolkit that we have now available to us. 20 years ago, my colleagues adopted inclusionary housing ordinance. So we either collect a fee or units from every unit that is built, every residential unit that is built in Walnut Creek. And we also have a commercial linkage fee, so that as people add square footage of commercial space, that does bring in jobs, and jobs require housing. There's a whole nexus involved in that. We collect those fees as well. And we've collected over $30 million in those fees over, I would say, the last 15 or 16 years. And it's translated into nearly 400 units of affordable housing. Because what we do is we use those dollars as the first money in, and the affordable developers are able to leverage that money to put in the other $6 to $7 in federal and state and county monies that they need. We have also been, we do specific plans. So there are two specific plans that we recently finished in our West Downtown and North Downtown areas, 360 acres of land. And really the focus was on how do we increase housing without losing job centers, and how do we improve transportation through those whole corridors, because those portions of our town sit right at the intersection of that busy freeway that carries 225,000 cars per day. Those specific plans have allowed our community to be engaged in the process of visioning the future and visioning how to basically accommodate additional housing and how we would do that best. And those, surprisingly, those two specific plans anticipate 3,300 net new housing units, which will translate to about half of what we need for our next RHNA cycle, which is really making us feel a little better. We only have another 3,300 to go. It also is allowed us to streamline the process of development and pre-do the environmental review at a program level, not at a project level. But it has been very instrumental in us driving development. Hand in hand with that, the community said they didn't want to give away additional density in the specific planning process without a guarantee of what's in it for the community that's there now. And so rather than give away all the density straight out in the specific plans, we had a two-tiered process. And so here's your new density, or here's your bonus density. And it's not density bonus law. Here's your additional density that you could be available for as a developer if you will deliver a specified community benefit. And it's a menu approach, but it's also flexible. And this is what the development community wanted, was they didn't want to spend a year negotiating whether they'd have to build a trail to get additional density. We have modified ADU ordinances, and we're using state grant money, probably LEAP or PLHA money, I can't remember which, to actually create permit-ready ADU plans of 4 sizes. 20 years ago, we reduced our parking requirements for residential projects near BART stations and the highways, which has allowed developers to slowly figure out there's a lot of wasted parking that can be built when people don't need all their cars all the time. We've streamlined the review for affordable housing. We have local density bonus laws, and we have partnered with affordable developers to be as creative as we can, and with the homeless and affordable housing advocates on how best to deliver these services. More to follow.
So John and Cindy, you've both already hit on this a little bit, but I'm curious if you can expand on some of your community engagement processes and strategies as it relates to housing, particularly affordable housing. So John, I know you mentioned, working with nonprofits and other organizations, so having those partnerships to really come in and help with the communication with the community. Cindy, you just mentioned that you had already gone to the community and seen what some of their benefits that they wanted, so you can have those conversations up front with your developers. But any tips for your colleagues on the line about positive public engagement strategies or what's worked in your communities?
I guess when we're talking about leadership for a rural county, and that's all I can speak for, I think rural counties really have to look at creating new policies or modifying existing policies and zoning categories to allow a wider, more diverse set of housing. For instance, we've had a lot of interest with what's called micro homes, which are typically smaller homes on a foundation, collects property tax, et cetera, as well as tiny home units, which a tiny home to me is on an axle, it's registered by DMV, it's mobile from one place to another, and it doesn't really fit that same model because it's a DMV registered vehicle. But we need to look at policies and zoning and trying to get the community engaged and understanding the need for that. So one of the other key areas is to look at the missing middle, i.e. our workforce housing. How do we create the right environment to co-locate housing where jobs are? And for us, that's primarily Eldorado's business park. So we've had a number of different projects come forward. I mentioned earlier in a mixed use category where you actually co-locate either in a horizontal or vertical format, commercial with residential housing. The advantage there obviously is people don't need their car anymore if they're able to work locally and they have their needs met locally. They can use a local transit bus, a shuttle, whatever is available to get their goods and services they need locally, but yet be able to get back and forth to work, which unlocks a lot of our opportunities on the roadways, because we all know that the state of California doesn't really want to expand highway capacity within with the exception of a few regions. So that's another major area, is looking at that missing middle form of workforce housing. And then the other major part for El Dorado County is incentivizing and looking at the use of auxiliary dwelling units, or ADUs. how do we make the best use of that state legislation to encourage existing single-family residential property owners to add an ADU, either for a family member, for guest purposes, whatever it is, because we're incentivizing some of those things. And I think that's really, if you've been following some of the current legislation, what SB 9 is trying to do in part is it's addressing taking single-family residential property and removing the restriction for that type of use and exactly expanding it to include other types of uses, such as a multifamily type of arrangement and other things. So whether that legislation passes or not, again, I would rather be out in front of it, encouraging ADUs where people really want to have that and they have the ability to design it, as opposed to waiting for something else to somewhat be pushed our direction. So those are some of the things, but engagement with the community gets into the dialogue and how do you encourage broad participation and not just the negatives, people that are against everything. And we have a number of those in any given community, but we have a whole lot more people who are more moderate in their thinking, neutral, would like to see more housing because they recognize their kids don't have any place to live when they graduate from high school and they can't get a job locally. So they've got to move out of county or something to do that. And then we have a lot of our youth that was educated here, graduated from high school, went to work somewhere. They have very good paying jobs. Now they want to move their young family back to our El Dorado Hills to experience the same kind of childhood and growing up amenities that they had. But now they've got to secure a business arrangement and they can afford to move back. But affordable housing would allow more of that to happen.
So I'd like to just address the question, the part of the question that was really about education and outreach with the community. I think we know that part of the barrier to more housing and a housing affordability is really what I'll call misinformation and misperceptions. People that perceive, oh no, it'll be more traffic, less services, I'll never find a parking place because they're not going to park that apartment building that's right next to the BART station, or that it's going to impact schools. And then there are the misperceptions that are out there as well. Very good friend calls every apartment building Section 8 housing. That's not Section 8 housing, not at $3,000 for a 1-bedroom apartment. And so there's misperceptions about who lives in there, that it's transient in nature. And what I have discovered over my years on the city council is you can do broad outreach. And so what we did is we have a monthly city manager's email newsletter. We have a quarterly print newsletter. And we basically focused on trying to turn the question of housing into a people story. It's about facts, but it's also about people. Because if you believe that all people who live in apartment buildings are transient in nature and Section 8, you're going to be really, really surprised if 50% of your community or 2/3 of your community is living in that housing, that they're the people that you've had kids in school with for years. It's also, I think, being able to have one-on-one conversations. We have a weekly farmers market booth for the city council. It's where we have our office hours. And the most common question we had is, well, why are you building so much multifamily housing downtown? And I discovered that a very large poster that showed our general plan map and kind of the picture of where it would land helped them, the community, to understand, oh, it's not going to be in my single family neighborhood. It's going to be away from me. So addressing, you can give information to 10 people, they'll give it to 10 more people. And my favorite story is a man who came up and was yelling at me at the farmer's market at how we could allow all of this multifamily housing in downtown. And within 6 months, he was coming up and complaining that the opening and the groundbreaking wasn't fast enough for the next multifamily project. So you can turn the ship of the tide of perception one at a time.
I do want to echo actually what John and Cindy were talking about for that engagement with the community. So putting on my former planning commissioner's hat, one of my favorite sayings, I repeat it ad nauseum, but it was the concept of tying housing with something that's already existing, the existing goals of what you want as a community. So a lot of people want more jobs in their jurisdiction, in their city. So I'd say ad nauseum, housing is where jobs sleep at night. because it's something that, when you put these two concepts together, it's like, oh yeah, it's something existing. People need to live somewhere if we keep saying we want more jobs. And so it's connecting what's important to the community already and then tying it into housing. So housing doesn't need to exist on its own plane. It can be tied into what's important to you as a community.
Appreciate all of those comments and a lot of key takeaways here of things that we've talked about a lot in community engagement, understanding the values of your community and what they want and what they want to see. And to my own point, connecting that to housing, having those individual conversations, Cindy, that may not be the most efficient, but can definitely be very effective. So you're trying to balance
the inside 300.
And then going back to where we started, John, the partnerships can be so valuable, whether you're working with your faith-based organizations or homeowners associations or service clubs or whomever that might be, that really connect with your community members on a day-to-day basis and can maybe translate some of the city speak that we get or county speak that we get so into, and can really help your community understand what those what's happening and what's moving forward. And just to the folks on the line, this is a much broader conversation about community engagement, and we're going to focus an entire webinar in a couple of months on just that topic as it relates to housing and development. So stay tuned for more if you're interested there. In looking at the time, I want to make sure we get to a few of the audience questions as well. We've had a few come in around infrastructure. So as we're talking about new housing development coming online, is there any advice you have, particularly as it relates to maybe water hookups? John, this question could go to you in terms of the rural aspect, because that can obviously, and then Cindy, from a more urban, you guys probably have differing opinions on some of the challenges here, but anything you guys can share in terms of how to meet infrastructure needs for new development or infill development?
Yeah, our county general plan identifies 3 different categories of our communities. One is called a community region, a rural center. And the community regions are those that have been identified for where majority of the housing growth will occur. And so those are areas that have been defined that have either existing infrastructure, i.e. major water ties that come along the highway, major power connective capabilities, or are scheduled to be developed to provide those. So that infrastructure is very, very important, and it's tied within our general plan in terms of what is buildable for affordable housing, et cetera. Because again, as I mentioned, the transit aspect of it, being able to get people moved without having to own an automobile is huge. And so you need to have a large enough community and adjacency to services that people feel comfortable that they can really live reasonably successful without having to drive a car every day. Let's put it that way. You can park the car for a major period of time, but you can get the services, good services, access to things you want without having to use the automobile. So that's certainly part of it. And I guess Cindy probably has some other thoughts on it.
Well, being from a smaller community, that is a really big question. So what was very helpful was that all of that was integrated into our 2 specific plans for our downtown area. So they looked at that infrastructure. They looked at the existing roadways. They looked at the bicycle and pedestrian pathways and what was really going to work. They looked at the sanitary, the water, the storm drains. And we are in a unique community in that we have 2 water districts that serve Walnut Creek and a separate sewer district. So there's a lot of special districts involved in what we need to do, but it's been identified. And just as an example of what can happen when you plan and you engage with the community in advance and you somehow figure out what you would need to do, in one of the 2 specific plans, there was a property at a corner. It's about an acre. And it was just not going to work very well for commercial development due to some constraints on the property. It is in contract for a 100% affordable project that would be roughly 100 units. But because they are applying for state and federal funding and grant fundings, they are sweeping in as part of that the improvements to the pedestrian and bike and roadway conditions that surround it. And so we are cobbling together money both from our traffic impact fees as well as what will be 2 projects and hopefully state grant monies that will allow us to actually implement those improvements. And so by planning ahead and really doing it that way, we have gotten down to the road level and being able to say, okay, in this area, we're, it's a $20 million project, and hopefully we will get all the funds to do it.
We've heard that from other jurisdictions, Cindy, that you have to cobble together funding sources. So you may get grant funding for the housing development, but then you need additional grant funds to pay for some of the infill pieces or other components of the project. And so it can be a big challenge. It has to read those grant guidelines very closely to make sure that you understand what can and can't be funded. And it's a huge task, definitely.
And then the rule of thumb is don't dig up a road without checking to see what else can be done while you're underneath.
There, yes.
If you dig up the road, you need broadband fiber, right?
Let's take maybe one or two more questions here. Mayan, we've gotten a couple questions about RHNA. This one is just kind of a logistics question. So their understanding is that RHNA focuses just on new development numbers. Can you talk a little bit about how potential rehab projects might fit into that landscape?
Yeah, so I mean, traditionally, RHNA has mostly been about additional new units to accommodate RHNA need. But there is a provision, I think it's called alternative sites requirements, where up to 25% of your RHNA allocation, you can credit rehabilitation projects, Project Home Key, which is a new program this time around. Those can actually be used towards your RHNA allocation or meeting your RHNA need in your housing element. There is a lot of analysis though required, so I'm not going to say it's an easy task to do, but it is a possibility and something worth exploring, especially if you do have a large amount of resources to be able to do this.
So would a good suggestion be for them to connect with their COG to talk through some of those?
Yeah, depending on your COG and its resources, but definitely reach out to HCD as well, because they do have memos on this and they'll be more than happy to guide you because they want to make their jobs and your jobs easier. So they're not out to get you.
All right, we are getting close to time, so I'm going to go ahead and put up the just a couple of closeout slides here. Here's our upcoming webinars. If you're interested, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about public engagement, but we're also going to talk about equity, climate resilient land use policies, and then we touched on this a little bit at the opening, but we're also going to have one focusing just on that nexus of housing and homelessness towards the end of this year. So if you're interested, all of this is on our website here. The panelists, if you will humor me for one final kind of closeout question, would just like to hear some high-level thoughts from each of you in terms of what it means to you to lead in this space. So what does it mean to you to lead on housing and development in your local communities?
Well, I think it means being willing to step up and recognize there is a need for housing and sharing with people the reason why that is the case, and to try to get them to understand that, again, if we don't take it under our own provisions to create this affordable housing, the state will do it. And none of us really want to see that as an end result. So that's it's not a threat. It's really just an inducement, if you will. It's an encouragement to have people open up their thought patterns that we're not going to be successful in just shutting down the county and saying no more growth. I'm sorry, that isn't going to work in any means. So I know there's areas like Marin County, evidently, that are pursuing some of those things due to water shortages, but we don't have that situation in El Dorado County, at least, because we're a county of origin for a lot of water supplies, and we do have a reasonable authorization for water storage in Folsom Lake and the reservoir system that feeds us. So water is not a deterrent right now in El Dorado County. It could be someday. So it's really more land values and other things. So leadership is being willing to establish new policy and to take the hard questions and the criticism sometimes, because there's always going to be vocal people that will be against any kind of development, particularly if it's somewhere near where they live.
Well, I think for me, the leading part, at least from the local level, is planning, asking the question, who are we planning for? Who are we building these for? And recognizing our community. I mean, we don't exist as a snapshot. It's planning for people who are already here and who will be here. And then tying that to our community needs. So I think just leading the community through that that's what it meant to me as a planning commissioner.
And I will agree with John and Mayan. I would say it's a few words. You have to be open. You have to be willing to listen to all sides. The affordable housing advocates, the homeless advocates, the development community, and obviously your constituents. You have to be willing to learn and to be informed and to understand how the development process works, how the market works, costs of things, as well as just all the nuances. And collaborative and innovative. We're doing a project right now. This is mixed use. Our Toyota dealership wants to take 6 acres of land and not only rebuild its dealership, but add either housing, hospitality, or office commercial, because they need to fiscalize that redevelopment. We're open to it because we don't want to lose the jobs. We don't want to lose the tax base, and it will be better for the community. You have to be willing to compromise. And at the end of the day, also, all good solutions are a reflection of compromise across multiple points of view.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those final thoughts. I do want to apologize if we didn't get to your question. We had a number of questions come in, but don't hesitate to reach out to us and follow up as needed. I just want to thank all of my panelists this afternoon. Cindy, John, Mayan, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your expertise, and all of your thoughts on this with our panelists. And thank you to our audience for joining us this afternoon and taking the time to learn more about this issue and really help navigate this issue in your community. So with that, panelists, any final thoughts or closing remarks before we end the webinar today?
You're on
Okay.
mute.
I just want to thank you and your staff and ILG for sponsoring this. I think these kinds of discussions where people can learn and understand that there are opportunities here. It's not a closed door, but you really do have to be creative. As Cindy pointed out, you have to have that optimistic creativity part of looking at what you can do and then be willing to compromise. That is absolutely the right messaging, I think, for people to understand if they're going to be successful. But thanks to ILG for sponsoring this and the continuing series.
Definitely echoing that.
Same here, and thanks for including me because I learned something every time.
Perfect. Thank you all so much, and thank you to everybody on the line. I hope you have a great afternoon.